The oppressive heat of a Nebraska summer pressed down on Hemlock, blurring the edges of the fields into a shimmering mirage. From the town square, the old clock tower chimed noon, its sound swallowed by the buzz of cicadas. Elm trees, heavy with leaves, cast pools of shade over manicured lawns and neat white picket fences. It was a picturesque tableau, the kind found on postcards, yet beneath the surface an unseen current pulled at the tranquility. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of something metallic, like rain on hot asphalt, hung in the air, clashing with the sweet perfume of honeysuckle. Sally May, perched on the edge of the creek bank, watched a dragonfly hover over the murky water. Its iridescent wings caught the sunlight, a fleeting spark of brilliance against the dull green. She traced patterns in the dust with a bare toe, her mind a tangle of half-formed thoughts. Her parents, like all the parents in Hemlock, were awash in a giddy excitement, their voices carrying on the breeze as they planned post-graduation celebrations. A new chapter, her mother had beamed earlier that morning, her eyes alight with dreams of Sally attending college. Sally had merely nodded, a practiced, distant smile on her lips. She felt as though she were observing her own life from a great distance, a character in a play whose lines she knew but whose motivations remained a mystery. A rustle in the tall grass announced Jedediah Finch before he appeared, his usual scowl firmly in place. He carried a fishing pole, though his attention seemed fixed on something far beyond the creek. "Still waiting for those fish to bite, Sally May?" he grunted, his voice rough around the edges. He sat heavily beside her, jostling a small rock that tumbled into the water. "They'll bite when they're ready," she replied, her gaze still fixed on the dragonfly. "Or perhaps they know something we don't," Jed snorted, but a flicker of understanding passed through his usually guarded eyes. "Speaking of knowing things," he began, then hesitated, kicking at a loose clump of earth. "Clara's been out by the old oak again, whispering to herself, they say." Clara Bellwether, once the brightest and most vibrant of their small circle, now moved through Hemlock like a ghost. Her artistic hands, once quick to sketch the beauty around her, now trembled, and her eyes held a haunted quality, as if she perpetually saw something no one else could. Sally felt a pang of unease. Clara's fragility was a constant reminder of the fine line they all walked. "Her parents think she's just nervous about graduation," Sally murmured, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. Her own parents, and Jed's, held the same innocent belief. They saw a future of college scholarships and promising careers. They didn't see the knowing glances, the shared, unspoken dread that settled over the seniors like a shroud. Jed ran a hand through his perpetually messy hair. "My old man's got the grill ready for tomorrow night. Said he's going to make enough ribs to feed the whole county." He said it without enthusiasm, his words hollow. They don't understand, do they? It was the question that hung unspoken between them, a silent agreement. How could their parents understand the seeds Mr. Thorne had planted, carefully, meticulously, over 4 years? Mr. Thorne. The name itself evoked a strange cocktail of reverence and fear in Sally. He had been their history teacher, a charismatic figure who could make the dry dates of ancient civilizations come alive. He'd leaned against his desk, his voice a low, melodious rumble, weaving tales of fallen empires and grand visions. "History," he'd said, his eyes scanning their faces, "is not merely a record of the past. It is a roadmap to the future. A future free of the imperfections that plague humanity. A future where the weak are purged for the good of the whole, creating a true utopia." His lessons had been mesmerizing, a subtle twisting of facts and philosophies. He spoke of weeds and gardens, of pruning and harvesting. He'd painted vivid pictures of a world reborn, a society sculpted by those brave enough to see the truth. The other teachers, preoccupied with curriculum and grades, had never noticed the subtle shift in their students, the way their eyes would glint with a strange, almost manic understanding after Thorne's classes. Their parents, too, had been oblivious, charmed by his eloquent speeches at PTA meetings. Sally remembered him singling her out once after a particularly potent lecture on societal decay. "You, Sally Mae," he'd said, his smile unsettlingly warm. "You have the vision, the clarity to see what others cannot. You will be instrumental in the new dawn." His words had resonated deep within her, a frightening validation that still echoed in her quiet moments. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Sally found Clara sitting beneath the ancient oak, its gnarled branches reaching towards the heavens like skeletal fingers. Clara's sketchbook lay open beside her, but her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes wide and unfocused. "Clara?" Sally's voice was soft, hesitant. Clara started, then blinked, her gaze slowly settling on Sally. "Sally Mae," she whispered, her voice reedy. "It's almost time. The harvest." Sally felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. She sat beside Clara, the familiar unease a tightening knot in her stomach. "Are you ready?" she asked, the words barely audible. Clara's lips trembled. "He says it's for the best. A clean slate. A new garden." Her eyes, however, held no conviction, only a profound, bottomless terror. "But sometimes I hear their laughter. My mother's laugh. And I wonder if they're really weeds at all." Sally looked at her friend, at the broken girl who had once been so full of life and color. She reached out, placing a hand on Clara's arm, a futile gesture against the monstrous ideas that had taken root in their minds. Graduation night was tomorrow, the culmination of 4 years of careful cultivation. The whispers of hemlock, once gentle summer breezes, were now a roaring gale, carrying them all towards an unthinkable dawn. The scent of chalk dust and old paper usually clung to Mr. Thorne's classroom, a comforting academic smell. Today, however, a faint, almost metallic tang seemed to permeate the air, sharpening the senses. Sunlight, fractured by the dusty window panes, laid stripes across the worn wooden desks where the Hemlock High graduating class sat, rigid and attentive. Mr. Thorne, with his impeccable tweed jacket and a gaze that seemed to hold both a challenge and a promise, tapped a pointer against a faded map of ancient civilizations. "History," he began, his voice a low, resonant hum, "is not merely a record of what was, but a blueprint for what can be. Every great leap forward, every societal evolution has demanded a cost, a weeding, if you will." He paused, letting the word hang, heavy and significant. "Think of a garden choked with weeds. Can the roses truly flourish until the foreign elements are removed?" Sally Mae, perched on the edge of her seat, felt a familiar tremor of unease and fascination. His words were like a hypnotic rhythm, subtly bypassing her conscious thought and settling directly into a deeper, more primal part of her mind. He spoke of ancient plagues, of necessary sacrifices made by enlightened leaders to preserve their people, to ensure a purer, stronger future. He never named the plague in Hemlock, but the implication was clear, a silent understanding passing between him and his students. It wasn't disease, but rather stagnation, the stubborn refusal of the old guard to embrace progress. Jedediah Finch, usually fidgeting or staring out the window, was utterly still, his knuckles white where he gripped his pencil. He saw the logic, cold and undeniable. His own father, a man rooted in unchanging routines, suddenly seemed less a protector and more a heavy anchor. Jed's jaw tightened. He'd always chafed under his father's strictures, but now a new, more dangerous resentment simmered. Mr. Thorne's gaze swept over them, lingering for a fraction on Jed, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Clara Bellwether, however, was a study in fragile terror. Her eyes, wide and luminous, darted around the room as if searching for an escape. She clutched a worn copy of The Great Gatsby, its pages dog-eared and stained. The images Thorne conjured, of a pristine future rising from the ashes of the old, twisted in her mind, mingling with waking nightmares of fire and loss. Her parents, kind and gentle, suddenly appeared as monstrous figures in her terrified imagination, their very love a suffocating embrace. She wanted to scream, to reject his insidious poison, but the words caught in her throat, strangled by an unseen hand. The others, she saw, were nodding, their faces mirroring a chilling blend of conviction and nascent zeal. Later, gathered under the ancient oak tree by the football field, the afternoon sun casting long, distorted shadows, the graduating class spoke in hushed, fervent tones. A palpable energy crackled among them, a shared secret that bound them tighter than any friendship. "He's right," whispered Brenda Jenkins, her voice hoarse with conviction. "They don't understand. They never will. They're stuck in their ways, holding us back." "It's for the best," Jedediah muttered, kicking at a loose clump of dirt. His usual gruffness was laced with a strange, almost righteous fervor. A new world needs new soil. Clean soil. He glanced at Sally, seeking confirmation. Sally Mae traced patterns in the dust with her shoe. She felt the seductive pull of Thorne's logic, the promise of a clear, unburdened future. Her own sadness, that pervasive, unidentifiable ache, seemed to promise resolution in his vision. If the source of all stagnation, all sorrow, could be purged, then perhaps peace could finally bloom. "It's about purpose," she said, her voice softer than usual. "He says we're the chosen ones to build it." Clara, however, huddled apart, her face pale, her eyes wide and unfocused. "But what about love?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "My mama's pies. My daddy's stories." Jedediah scoffed, though a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. "Sentimentality is a weakness, Clara. He taught us that. It's a plague of the heart, blinding us to what's necessary." A cold wind rustled through the oak leaves, a sound like dry whispers. The students, a unified front, turned their backs on Clara's fragile protests. They saw only the path ahead, illuminated by Mr. Thorne's vision, a path cleared of all obstacles. The seeds of a new world, they believed, were already beginning to sprout within them, ready to be watered with a terrible purpose. Graduation night's embrace. The gymnasium doors, adorned with crepe paper streamers in Hemlock High's scarlet and gold, swung open with cheerful frequency. Laughter, thick with the scent of cheap cologne and hairspray, spilled into the warm evening air. Families, dressed in their Sunday best, streamed inside, their faces beaming with the unadulterated pride of parents whose children were on the cusp of a future they themselves had meticulously planned. The folding chairs, arranged in neat rows facing the makeshift stage, filled quickly. A hum of anticipation, innocent and light, vibrated through the room. Grandmothers dabbed at their eyes, fathers adjusted their ties, and younger siblings fidgeted, all blissfully unaware of the chilling undercurrent flowing beneath the festive surface. Sarah May, or Sally, as her parents insisted on calling her, stood by the entrance, a small, polite smile fixed on her lips. Her mother, a woman with perpetually worried eyes and a formidable beehive hairdo, clutched her arm. "My little girl, all grown up," she cooed, her voice thick with emotion. Mr. Henderson, Sally's father, a stout man with a booming laugh that usually grated on Sally's nerves, clapped her on the shoulder. "You'll do great things, Pumpkin. We know it." Sally nodded, the smile feeling like a mask. Her insides churned with a peculiar blend of fear and a strange, almost clinical detachment. She looked at her parents, their faces etched with love and hope, and saw not her protectors, but obstacles. The word echoed Thorne's lecture, cold and sharp. A flicker of doubt, a ghost of her former self tried to surface, but she pushed it down. This was for the greater good, for the clean future. Yet, the thought brought no comfort, only a hollow ache. She simply nodded again, her gaze drifting past them to the arriving families, each face a new, unwitting participant in the night's grand design. Across the gym, Jedediah Finch stood awkwardly by the water cooler, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the scuffed linoleum. His father, a grizzled farmer with hands like knotted roots, clapped him hard on the back, nearly sending Jed sprawling. "You'll take over the South 40, son, just like we planned. Good, honest work. No more of that book-learning nonsense." Jed grunted, the words a familiar refrain. He could feel his father's eyes on him, a weighty expectation. He imagined his father's proud, calloused hands, hands that had built their farm from nothing, hands that would soon be— He swallowed hard, a metallic taste blooming on his tongue. Thorne's words about the old guard felt like a brand on his skin. He couldn't meet his father's gaze, couldn't bear to see the pride that would soon turn to confusion, then to something far worse. A fresh wave of guilt, sharp and suffocating, washed over him, momentarily blurring the righteous anger Thorne had so carefully cultivated. In a quiet corner near the stage, Clara Bellwether sat hunched over a worn, leather-bound notebook, her charcoal pencil dancing across the page. Her usual vibrant clothes were replaced by a muted gray dress, and her once lively eyes held a distant, haunted quality. The page was filled with intricate, almost frantic sketches, not the sun-drenched landscapes she used to favor, but twisted cornstalks with skeletal fingers, faces contorted in silent screams, and a single, stark image of a bloodied scythe, its blade reflecting a fractured moon. A few parents, passing by with cheerful chatter, glanced at her, then quickly looked away, sensing the palpable unease that radiated from her. Clara didn't notice. She was lost in the labyrinth of her own mind, the pencil a desperate attempt to externalize the horrors that had taken root within her. Each stroke was a whisper of the impending doom, a silent prophecy etched in graphite. A tear, hot and singular, traced a path down her cheek, blurring the dark lines of her latest drawing. The air in the gymnasium, once festive, now felt thick and heavy, pressing down on her, a premonition of the night's embrace. The trap is set. The principal's voice, a monotonous stream of platitudes about boundless futures, faded into the background, a mere hum beneath the palpable tension. Sally's smile, a fragile mask, locked with Jedediah's across the rows of folding chairs. His jaw was a hard line, a muscle twitching near his ear, yet his eyes held an unyielding resolve. Her gaze then darted to Clara, hunched, hands clasped tightly in her lap. But even from a distance, Sally caught the subtle affirmation. It was time. A deep breath expanded Sally's chest, a fleeting gulp of crisp, cold air before the immense weight of their undertaking settled back. She shifted, feigning discomfort, then, with an almost imperceptible lean, began her slow egress from the row. Her parents, blissfully beaming, barely registered her departure. The aisle stretched endlessly, each step a deliberate, hushed act of defiance. Reaching the double doors at the gym's rear, her fingers brushed the cool brass handle as she slipped through. The corridor offered a muted contrast to the vibrant pandemonium within. The distant strains of the school band, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the murmur of hundreds, now became a dull roar. Jedediah followed moments later, his broad frame seemingly absorbing the light as he moved. He gave Sally a curt, grim nod, then turned to the heavy emergency bar lock on the left-hand door. His farm-calloused fingers found their purchase, and with a soft click, the first barrier yielded. Clara emerged last, her face ashen, eyes wide and vacant, as if still fixated on the specters she'd sketched. She clutched a worn leather satchel to her chest, knuckles bone white. Her gaze darted around the empty hallway, a shiver tracing her spine. Jedediah placed a reassuring, if rough, hand on her shoulder. "You all right, Bellwether?" he rumbled, his voice low. Clara flinched at the contact, then nodded, her breath catching. It's just so quiet out here," she whispered, her voice a reedy rasp. "Good," Jedediah affirmed, turning back to his task. He grappled with the heavy bolt on the second door. It groaned in protest, a metallic shriek that set Sally's teeth on edge. She watched him, a strange detachment settling over her. This was more than a door. It was a demarcation. Beyond it lay the future Thorne had promised, a future cleansed of the past. Finally, with a loud, resounding thud, the bolt slid home. The sound reverberated through the corridor, a final, definitive punctuation. The lively sounds from within the gym dimmed, a muffled, distant echo. The laughter now seemed strained, the music hollow. It wasn't silent, not yet, but the vibrancy had been leached from the noise. Jedediah stepped back, dusting his hands on his trousers, a grim satisfaction etched on his face. "That's done," he announced, his voice carrying in the abrupt quiet. Sally approached the doors, pressing her ear against the cool wood. She could still discern the faint, distorted strains of the alma mater. Her parents were in there, waving, smiling, proud. A hollow ache, familiar and unwelcome, twisted in her gut. She suppressed it, pushing it deep, deeper, until it was merely a faint echo. Clara, meanwhile, had sunk to the floor, her back against the cool cinder block wall, knees drawn to her chest. She began to rock gently, a soft, tuneless hum escaping her lips, her eyes still wide, fixed on some unseen horror. Jedediah looked at her, then back at the bolted doors. "They won't even know what hit them," he muttered, more to himself than to them. He moved towards the exit leading outside, casting a quick glance over his shoulder. "Let's go. Thorne will be waiting." Sally took one last look at the impenetrable doors, then followed Jedediah, leaving Clara to her silent torment for a moment longer. The silence was now absolute, broken only by Clara's soft hum and the scuff of their shoes on the linoleum. The air outside would be cold, crisp, and clean. A new beginning, Thorne had called it. A harvest. The cool night air, thick with the scent of damp earth and distant cornfields, offered little comfort. Sally shivered, though not from the cold. Jedediah, his jaw set in a hard line, clutched the worn leather strap of the satchel Clara had handed him, his knuckles white. Clara herself stood a few paces away, her shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the illuminated windows of the gymnasium. The faint, tinny strains of the school band, a jaunty rendition of Pomp and Circumstance, still bled through the brick walls, a cruel counterpoint to the dread coiling in Sally's gut. Jedediah checked his pocket watch for the third time in as many minutes. The glow from the dial painted his face in a fleeting, spectral light. "Almost time," he grunted, the words barely audible above the distant music. Sally nodded, her gaze sweeping over the familiar grounds of Hemlock High. The old oak trees lining the drive cast long, gnarled shadows that danced in the intermittent glow of the streetlights. She'd walked these paths countless times, her younger self dreaming of a future far removed from the mundane rhythms of small-town life. Now, those dreams felt like ash in her mouth. The new beginning Thorne promised felt less like dawn and more like an eclipse. Clara let out a choked sound, a small, pained gasp that drew Jedediah's attention. He turned, his gruff exterior softening fractionally. "You all right, Clara?" She shook her head, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It's still so loud." Her voice was a reedy whisper, thin and fragile. The music, though muffled, seemed to mock their silence, their hidden vigil. It was a celebration, a promise of futures, completely oblivious to the impending reckoning. Sally closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound, to block out the image of the faces inside. Her parents, the parents of her classmates, all beaming with pride. Thorne's words echoed in her mind. A necessary pruning, a cleansing. She tried to believe it, to truly feel the conviction Thorne had so skillfully woven into their minds, but a cold, gnawing doubt persisted. Then, just as the minute hand on Jedediah's watch clicked precisely to the 8, the music died. Abruptly, completely. The sudden, profound silence was a physical blow, a vacuum that sucked the air from Sally's lungs. It wasn't a fade-out, but a guillotine drop, severing the last thread of normalcy. The world outside the gymnasium walls seemed to hold its breath. In the sudden void, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the distant croak of a frog, even the frantic beat of Sally's own heart became amplified, unnervingly loud. The celebration inside, the laughter, the applause, all vanished as if a switch had been flipped. From the deepest shadows of the surrounding trees, figures began to emerge. They materialized silently, like specters, their faces grim and unreadable in the dim light. These were not the fresh-faced graduates in caps and gowns. These were soldiers. Each student carried a weapon, the glint of polished wood and steel from hunting rifles, the wicked curve of sharpened scythes. The tools of the farm, now repurposed for a different kind of harvest. Their eyes, when they caught the ambient light, held a disturbing blend of cold determination and something else, something akin to a desperate, hardened resignation. Sally recognized faces she'd seen in classrooms for years. Bobby Henderson, usually the class clown, now gripped a shotgun with an unsettling stillness. Martha Finch, Jedediah's cousin, her delicate hands surprisingly firm around the hilt of a scythe. Their youth seemed to have been stripped away, replaced by an ancient, chilling resolve. They moved with an eerie coordination, spreading out to form a wide perimeter around the gymnasium. Each step was deliberate, each position chosen with precision. The building, once a symbol of community and learning, was now a fortress under siege. Sally watched them, a strange detachment washing over her. She was one of them, yet she felt like an observer, watching a macabre play unfold. Jedediah straightened, his shoulders squaring. He looked at Sally, then at Clara. His eyes, usually clouded with a mix of anger and confusion, were now clear, focused. "They're ready," he said, his voice low and steady. "Thorne's Harvest." Clara didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the line of armed students, her body trembling almost imperceptibly. Sally felt a tremor too, a deep vibration of fear and something else, something she couldn't name. The silence, once jarring, now settled like a shroud. The stage was set. The sudden, jarring silence following the cut-off melody of the school band was a physical blow. It hung in the humid evening air, thick and suffocating, before being ripped apart by a sound that would forever be etched into the very stones of Hemlock High. A collective gasp, swiftly followed by a rising tide of screams. Not the playful shouts of teenagers, but raw, primal terror. Jedediah flinched, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle twitched in his cheek. His hand instinctively went to the hunting knife sheathed at his hip, a phantom comfort. He had faced down rabid coyotes, broken wild horses, but this was different. The sounds from the gymnasium were a sickening symphony of fear and violence. A cacophony of shattering glass, frantic pounding, and the wet, guttural thuds that turned his stomach. He saw Sally's shoulders stiffen, her eyes wide and fixed on the gym doors, unblinking. Clara, beside them, crumpled in on herself, a soft, whimpering sound escaping her lips as she pressed her hands over her ears. Mr. Thorne, his silhouette sharp against the fading light, remained utterly composed. His gaze was distant, almost serene, as if he were observing a carefully orchestrated performance rather than a massacre. "The harvest," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the escalating chaos, "has begun." A shadow detached itself from the line of armed students, moving with a disturbing efficiency. It was Billy, the star quarterback, now wielding a scythe that glinted wickedly under the lone security light. He moved with a practiced, almost casual swing, and a fresh wave of screams erupted from the gym's shattered windows. Jedediah caught a fleeting glimpse of Mrs. Peterson, the English teacher, her face contorted in a silent shriek before Billy's shadow enveloped her. Then came the gunshots, sharp and echoing, each report a punctuation mark in the unfolding horror. They weren't precise, aimed shots, but wild, desperate sprays, like a child emptying a cap gun, only with lethal consequences. The air vibrated with the concussive force, and the smell of gunpowder mingled with something metallic and sweet. Sally's breath hitched. She saw a figure at one of the broken windows, struggling, a blur of white lace from a graduation gown. It was Sarah Jenkins, her face a mask of pleading terror, her hand reaching out, and then a familiar face. Tommy Miller, the shyest boy in their class, stepped into view, his eyes disturbingly blank. He raised a rifle, slowly, deliberately, and pulled the trigger. The white lace vanished. Jedediah felt a cold dread seep into his bones. This wasn't the heroic purging Thorne had described. This was slaughter. He wanted to look away, to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. He scanned the faces of his classmates, illuminated by the harsh glare of the security lights. There was Beth, usually so vivacious, now moving like a robot, reloading her shotgun with a vacant stare. And Mark, who used to joke about everything, his face now a rigid mask as he dragged something heavy from the building. Miles away, at the edge of town, Mr. Henderson, the proprietor of the general store, was locking up for the night. The celebratory sounds of graduation had been a comforting backdrop to his evening routine, but now a different sound carried on the breeze. A distant, unsettling wail, followed by a series of sharp reports. He paused, his hand on the padlock, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. The air felt heavy, charged with something ominous. He dismissed it as fireworks, a late, overly enthusiastic celebration, but the unsettling silence that followed the gunfire was more chilling than any noise. He shook his head, a frown creasing his brow, and pulled the store's heavy door shut, unwittingly sealing himself off from the unfolding nightmare. Back at Hemlock High, Jedediah's gaze landed on Mr. Thorne again. The man's expression hadn't changed. He was watching the carnage with an almost paternal satisfaction. It was then that Jedediah felt a tremor of true fear, not for himself, but for what they had become, for what Thorne had made them. He looked at Sally, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line, and then at Clara, who had begun to rock back and forth, a low, keening sound emanating from her. The sounds from the gym seemed to intensify, reaching a fever pitch, before slowly, sickeningly, beginning to subside. The harvest was indeed underway, and the fields of hemlock were being soaked red. The first rays of dawn stretched like pale, bony fingers across the flat expanse of hemlock, painting the edges of the cornfields in a sickly yellow-orange. A chilling quiet had settled over the town, replacing the usual symphony of morning birds and distant farm machinery. No smoke curled from chimneys, no dogs barked their customary greetings. It was a silence that screamed. Inside the small, unassuming house on Elm Street, Sally Mae sat cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom, a porcelain doll clutched to her chest. Her eyes, wide and unnervingly dry, stared at a spot on the faded floral wallpaper. The scent of burnt sugar from the kitchen, a phantom from last night's aborted celebration, clung to the air, cloying and sickening. She'd heard the distant sirens hours ago, then the hushed, urgent voices, but a strange detachment had taken hold, a numb shell around her frantic heart. Her hand, however, trembled slightly, betraying the icy grip of fear. Jedediah, meanwhile, was on the move. He'd left his own home an hour after the sirens faded, driven by a restless energy he couldn't contain. The air was thick with a metallic tang he couldn't place, and the dew on the grass felt strangely viscous beneath his worn boots. He peered into the windows of homes, seeing toys scattered on porches, bicycles leaning against fences, all frozen in time. A child's cry, thin and reedy, drifted from the Peterson place, followed by another, closer this time, from the Millers. He clenched his jaw, the muscles in his neck tightening. He knew. He didn't need to see inside to understand. By the time the sun had fully risen, painting the sky in a relentless, unforgiving blue, the first of the town's children began to emerge. A toddler, no older than 3, stumbled onto a porch, rubbing sleep from his eyes, calling for his mother. Then a girl, perhaps 7, stood in the middle of her yard, her pigtails askew, a tear streak drying on her cheek. The collective murmur of confusion and distress began to build, a rising tide of bewildered sorrow. Clara Bellwether was the last to stir. She lay curled on her grandmother's floral sofa, a blanket pulled tight around her chin. The nightmares had been relentless. Distorted faces, the sound of tearing fabric, a voice whispering, "Harvest."
When she finally opened her eyes, the sun was streaming through the lace curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the silent air. Her throat was raw, her head pounding. She rose unsteadily, moving through the house, calling out, her voice a fragile whisper. "Grandma? Mama?"
Only the echoes answered, mocking her. She found her grandmother's knitting needles still stuck in a half-finished scarf on the kitchen table, a teacup with a cold brown residue beside it. The stillness was a physical weight pressing down on her chest. The first police cruisers, followed by state patrol vehicles, arrived in a somber procession. The sight that greeted them at Hemlock High School would forever haunt their memories. The double doors were splintered, forced open, revealing a carnage beyond comprehension. Inside, the gymnasium was a tableau of horror, a silent, bloody testament to a night of unimaginable violence. The air, even from outside, was thick with the scent of iron and fear. Sheriff Brody, a man who had seen his share of tragedy, emerged from the building, his face ashen, his gaze distant. He looked at the assembled officers, then towards the cornfields that stretched endlessly behind the school, their stalks rustling in the morning breeze like whispering secrets. "Thorne," he rasped, his voice hoarse. "He's gone. Vanished, like a ghost into the fields." The search began, meticulous and desperate, fanning out into the vast green labyrinth. But the corn offered no trace, no footprint, no discarded item. Elias Thorne, the man who had orchestrated the Hemlock massacre, had melted into the land he claimed to understand so well, leaving behind a town of bewildered children and a lingering question mark that hung heavy in the unforgiving morning air. The orphans of Hemlock were awake, and the world they knew had been irrevocably shattered. The padded walls of the asylum room offered little comfort. Sally Mae sat cross-legged on the floor, her gaze fixed on a faint stain on the ceiling, a ghostly Rorschach blot that seemed to shift with every beat of her heart. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the clatter of a food tray and the soft creak of the door as nurses came and went. She spoke to no one, her vocal cords seemingly atrophied, preserving the silence that had become her constant companion. Her mind, however, was a frantic hive, buzzing with fragmented images, Jedediah's grim face, Clara's wide, terrified eyes, Thorne's silhouette against the burning gym. The new beginning, he promised, had been a charnel house, and she, a willing participant. A cold knot of shame tightened in her gut, a shame so profound it eclipsed all other feelings. In a room 2 floors below, Jedediah Finch paced, a caged animal. His fists, perpetually clenched, were raw from punching the soft wall, a futile attempt to expel the inferno raging within him. Guilt, a heavy, suffocating blanket, had settled upon him. He saw his father's eyes, wide with disbelief in the final seconds before. Jed shook his head violently, trying to dislodge the memory. He'd followed orders, done what was expected. He'd believed in Thorne, in the promise of a purer world. Now, the world was a blur of white walls and muffled sounds, and his only companions were the specters of his actions. He hadn't spoken a word since the arrests, his jaw locked, his throat a desert. The doctors, with their gentle questions and probing eyes, received only a stony glare. Clara Bellwether, in her own isolated cell, spent her hours curled into a fetal position beneath a thin blanket, her artistic hands now lifeless and limp. The vibrant colors of her imagination had been replaced by a monochrome landscape of despair. She saw faces in the shadows, heard whispers in the ventilation system. Her mind, once a sanctuary of creativity, had become a prison of self-recrimination. The memory of her mother's scream, shrill and agonizing, echoed incessantly in her ears. She hadn't merely witnessed the horror. She had been part of it, a silent, complicit figure in the unfolding tragedy. Her eyes, once bright with youthful dreams, were now vacant, mirroring the emptiness within. The doctors assigned to the Hemlock High students were baffled. They called them the Silent Ones, a cohort of teenagers exhibiting profound catatonia or selective mutism. Dr. Albright, a man with kind eyes and a weary slump to his shoulders, reviewed Sally Mae's chart for the 10th time. No response to stimuli, minimal eye contact, self-feeding, but otherwise completely withdrawn, he murmured to his intern. It's as if their minds have simply shut down. He leaned closer to the one-way mirror, watching Sally trace invisible patterns on the floor. Her stillness was unsettling, an unnatural calm that hinted at a deep, unplumbed trauma. One evening, as the fluorescent lights hummed a monotonous lullaby, Nurse Peterson was making her rounds. She paused outside Jedediah's room, checking his chart. The boy was sprawled on his cot, facing the wall. She heard a faint rustling, then a guttural whisper that sent a chill down her spine. It was Jedediah, his voice raspy from disuse, but clear in the quiet hallway. The reunion. It's coming. Nurse Peterson's breath hitched. She pressed her ear closer to the door, her heart hammering. The words were repeated, a low, fervent murmur, almost a prayer. The reunion is coming. Thorne will bring us together again. A shiver traced its way down her spine. She hurried away, her rubber soles squeaking on the polished linoleum, the unsettling whisper echoing in her mind. The silence of the asylum had been broken, but the words that emerged from the void were far more terrifying than the quiet they had replaced. The lingering whisper. The wind, once thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder and spilled blood, gradually surrendered to the sweet, dusty smell of drying corn. Years bled into one another, marked by the slow return of green to the scorched earth and the hesitant peal of a new church bell. Hemlock, a town of ghosts and whispers, began to knit itself back together, not with the robust stitches of a healthy community, but with the fragile, almost transparent thread of necessity. New families, lured by cheap land and the promise of a fresh start, drifted in, their children's laughter a thin counterpoint to the ever-present silence. The gymnasium, once a charnel house, was razed, replaced by a simple memorial stone etched with too many names. Yet, beneath the veneer of normalcy, the town remained an open wound, perpetually scabbed over, but never truly healed. Within the sterile confines of the state asylum, Sally Mae moved through her days with a quiet precision. Her hands, once prone to trembling, now folded laundry with a meticulous calm, her movements betraying no flicker of the tumultuous landscape within. She observed everything. The fleeting expressions of the nurses, the patterns of dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun, the way the shadows lengthened across the linoleum floor. Her gaze was deep-seated, holding a sadness that time had only deepened, a quiet desperation to understand the incomprehensible. She rarely spoke, her voice a fragile thing, but her mind was a constant whirl of catalogued memories, each detail polished to a sharp, painful gleam. The whisper of Jedediah's reunion had settled in the marrow of her bones, a low hum beneath the surface of her outwardly calm existence. Jedediah, meanwhile, had found an uneasy peace in the asylum's workshops, his hands, once stained with violence, now shaping wood into crude, functional furniture. His frame had broadened, his jawline more set, but the anger that simmered beneath his gruff exterior remained a volatile force. He worked with a fierce, almost punishing intensity, each hammer blow a silent exorcism of the guilt that clung to him like a shroud. He rarely spoke of the past, deflecting any probing questions with a glare that promised retribution. Yet, in the quiet solitude of his bunk at night, the word reunion echoed, a terrifying promise. He saw it in the eyes of the other former students, those broken souls who populated the asylum's wards. A shared, unspoken understanding, a chilling undercurrent to their forced rehabilitation. It was a secret they carried, a dark communion that bound them tighter than any chains. Clara, her once vibrant imagination now a treacherous landscape, drifted in and out of lucidity. The asylum's art therapy room, meant to be a sanctuary, often became a canvas for her nightmares. Her fingers, once deft with watercolors, now smeared charcoal across paper, creating unsettling abstract forms that hinted at the horrors she couldn't articulate. She spoke in hushed tones, sometimes to herself, sometimes to unseen entities, her words a tangled web of beauty and terror. Her eyes, once sparkling with life, now held a faraway, haunted look, as if perpetually gazing at a scene invisible to others. The whisper of the reunion was a serpent in her mind, coiling around her thoughts, making the line between reality and delusion thinner with each passing day. She believed it implicitly, a dark prophecy echoing Jedediah's pronouncement, a terrifying certainty that bled into her art, filling it with an ominous sense of foreboding. Years became decades. The world outside the asylum walls roared and changed, but within, a timeless stasis persisted. The Hemlock graduates, now older, their faces etched with the passage of time and the indelible marks of their trauma, still carried the shared secret. The reunion wasn't just Jedediah's delusion. It had become their collective, unspoken expectation. It manifested in furtive glances across the cafeteria, in the sudden silences when a new nurse entered a room, in the way their hands would unconsciously twitch at the sound of a distant train whistle. It was a phantom bell tolling in the back of their minds, a chilling anticipation that solidified with each passing year, patiently waiting for Thorne to call them home. A strange signal. The hum started subtly, a low thrum beneath the veneer of ordinary life, like the distant vibration of train tracks felt before the engine is even visible. Sally May, now an archivist in the asylum's dilapidated library, first noticed it in the margins. Newspaper headlines, scanned for historical accuracy, began to echo with a strange resonance. Reports of unexplained mass bird migrations, flocks moving with unnerving precision. Stories of localized, inexplicable power surges, brief blackouts that seemed to follow a peculiar, almost rhythmic pattern. A radio program, usually filled with vapid chatter, once played a sequence of tones that grated against her teeth, a series of high-pitched whistles followed by a deep, resonant bell-like sound. No one else seemed to notice. The other patients dismissed it as static, the nurses as faulty wiring. But Sally, tracing the faint ink lines of an old weather map, felt a chill crawl up her spine. The pattern, once she looked for it, was everywhere. In the way the wind rustled the dry leaves outside her window, in the irregular blinking of a faulty fluorescent light, even in the cadence of a nurse's footsteps. It was a language she understood, not with her ears, but with an intrinsic, terrifying part of her mind that Thorne had cultivated years ago. It spoke of proximity, of an approaching convergence. Jedediah, out in the asylum's perpetually muddy yard, felt it in his bones. He'd been chopping wood for the kitchen, the rhythmic thwack of the axe against the splitting oak a comfort, a simple, brutal task that mirrored his own existence. Then, a peculiar sensation began to build behind his eyes, a pressure that pulsed in time with an unheard beat. Dreams, vivid and unsettling, had plagued him for weeks. He saw himself walking through endless cornfields, the stalks taller than any man, their dry leaves rasping against each other like hushed whispers. In these dreams, a voice, deep and resonant, not Thorne's exactly, but undeniably of Thorne, would murmur about the harvest, about the gathering of seeds. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, a strange compulsion to simply go tugging at him. Today, as he lifted the axe, the impulse was stronger, a magnetic pull toward the horizon, toward the distant, hazy line where the sky met the earth. He paused, the axe held aloft, his calloused hands trembling almost imperceptibly. He knew what it meant. The reunion was not a prophecy anymore. It was a command, a deep-seated instinct taking root. Clara, secluded in her art therapy room, saw the signal in the swirling blues and greens of her watercolors. The therapist, a kindly but obtuse woman, praised her abstract expressionism, seeing only the turmoil of a fragile mind. But Clara saw more. The brushstrokes, once wild and chaotic, now formed intricate, almost geometric patterns, repeating motifs of intertwined cornstalks, of a stylized, all-seeing eye. The colors themselves seemed to vibrate, a luminescence that hummed with a low frequency only she perceived.
She heard sounds, too, not with her ears but deep within her skull. A distant, almost subliminal melody. A series of chimes that seemed to echo from the forgotten corners of her memory. It was the call, unmistakable and chilling. She felt the urge to etch the symbols into everything. The walls, her own skin, the very air itself. The world was beginning to hum with Thorne's silent symphony, a dark overture to a long-awaited, dreaded performance. She dipped her brush in crimson, painting a single stark drop, knowing the reunion was not just coming, but was already here, woven into the fabric of their perception. Dread of the gathering. The rhythmic hum beneath the floorboards of the asylum wasn't just a tremor. It was a heartbeat. Sally Mae felt it in her teeth, a low thrum that vibrated through the worn soles of her slippers. It had been there for days, a subtle presence growing steadily more insistent, like a hand slowly closing around her throat.
She sat on the edge of her bed, a tattered copy of a medical journal open on her lap, though her eyes scanned the blank wall opposite. The silent symphony, as Clara had so poetically termed it, was no longer silent. It was a cacophony of carefully orchestrated sensory input, each element a thread in a tapestry of dread Thorne was weaving. Her mind, usually a quiet pool of melancholy, now pulsed with a frantic energy. The power surges, the specific tone she'd heard, the geometric patterns in her dreams that mirrored the asylum's unsettling architecture. They weren't random. They were cues, like a conductor signaling his orchestra. And the reunion. The word, once a whispered promise of escape and belonging, now tasted like ash. It wasn't a gathering of lost souls. It was a summons, a forced convergence. Thorne was calling them back, not to comfort, but to complete whatever twisted vision he'd begun that night in Hemlock. The realization solidified into a cold, hard knot in her stomach. They weren't just survivors. They were tools. Down the hall, a guttural roar tore through the forced quiet. Jedediah. His anger, a constant, simmering presence since Hemlock, had finally ignited. Sally flinched, recognizing the sound of furniture being overturned. She pictured him, fists clenched, a vein throbbing in his temple. He'd been quieter than usual, brooding, the constant tremor in his hands betraying a turmoil he refused to voice. But the rising crescendo of the symphony, the subtle shifts in the air, had finally broken through his carefully constructed stoicism. "That son of a bitch!" Jedediah's voice, raw and gravelly, sliced through the thin walls. "He thinks he can just call us back? After everything? After what he made us do?" A crash, followed by the shattering of glass, punctuated his fury. "He's a monster, and we were just his goddamn puppets." His words echoed, a stark contrast to the whispered reverence they'd once held for Thorne. The anger, once directed inwards at his own perceived weakness, now had a focal point, the architect of their destruction. The guilt that had gnawed at him for years morphed into a scorching, righteous rage. He'd been manipulated, used, and the sheer audacity of Thorne to reassert his control, even from afar, was an insult Jedediah couldn't bear. Meanwhile, in her own small room, Clara Bellwether huddled in a corner, her knees drawn to her chest, her eyes wide and unfocused. The cornfields of her dreams were no longer distant, hazy images. They were vivid, almost painfully real. She could smell the dry earth, feel the rough texture of the stalks against her spectral hands.
And in the center of the field, at the end of a long, dark path, a structure was beginning to coalesce. A barn, perhaps, but impossibly large, its silhouette jagged against a bruised purple sky. Then he appeared within her mind's eye. Thorne. Not as a shadow or a whisper, but fully formed, his piercing gaze fixed not on her, but on the evolving structure. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips, a look of profound satisfaction. He raised a hand, and as he did, the barn seemed to ripple, to shift, as if responding to his unspoken command. Other figures, obscured by shadow, began to emerge from the periphery of her vision, moving in a slow, deliberate march towards the burgeoning edifice. They were like puppets on strings, their movements jerky and unnatural. The reunion was not just a metaphor. It was a physical convergence, a place, and Thorne was waiting. The images pulsed with an undeniable magnetism, pulling at her, drawing her towards that ominous gathering in the heart of the corn. The dread was a physical weight, pressing down on her, leaving her breathless. The silent symphony had become a scream. Called back to the cornfields. The hum vibrated in Sally's teeth, a low thrum that bypassed her ears and settled deep in her skull. It wasn't a sound. It was a command, as undeniable as the sun rising. Thorne. Even after all these decades, the name was a poison on her tongue, yet the pull was irresistible. She stared at the chipped porcelain of her teacup, seeing not the weak brew but the swirling patterns of the cornfields, the oppressive green stretching to the horizon. She had spent a lifetime trying to outrun that night, to scrub the stench of iron and fear from her memory, but it clung to her like a second skin. Now, the old man's call was clear. Thorne had answers, or, at least, he had the source of all her questions. Closure, perhaps, or merely another layer of torment. She didn't know, but the alternative,
To remain ignorant, to let the ghost of that night continue to gnaw, was worse. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 60 years, Sally Mae pushed herself from the worn armchair. The road ahead would be long and likely paved with pain, but she was going. Jedediah felt the tremor in his bones, a familiar agitation that had simmered beneath his skin since the asylum. It wasn't the quiet, insidious hum Sally described. For Jed, it was a searing heat, a renewed spark of the old rage. Thorne. The name brought a guttural growl to his throat. He'd spent a lifetime trying to forget, trying to build a wall around the raw wound of his complicity. But the bastard wouldn't stay buried. Now, this signal. It felt like Thorne was plucking at a string inside him, a puppet master twitching an old, broken marionette. Jed's knuckles whitened as he gripped the worn armrest of his rocking chair.
He wouldn't be a puppet again. He would go, yes, but not to obey. He would go to confront, to demand an accounting, to finally shove that man's twisted vision back down his throat. Revenge, perhaps, or at least the satisfaction of looking him in the eye and spitting in it. He pushed himself up, his old joints protesting, a fire rekindling in his rheumy eyes. Clara traced the ghostly outlines on the window pane, her breath fogging the glass. The call was a kaleidoscope of images in her mind, the endless rows of corn, taller than a man, rustling secrets. Thorne's face, younger, sharper, radiating a terrifying charisma. The fleeting, terrified eyes of parents in the gymnasium. The glint of steel. It wasn't a hum for her. It was a symphony of echoes, a chorus of the damned, pulling her inexorably forward. She saw the meeting point, a derelict barn on the edge of a field she knew in her bones, a place where the earth itself seemed to whisper forgotten horrors. Her hand trembled as she pulled a threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. She didn't want to go. The fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but the visions were too potent, too real. They promised understanding, a final piece to the shattered mosaic of her life, or perhaps simply a horrifying confirmation of her deepest fears. She had to follow. The path was already laid out in her mind, a ribbon of sorrow stretching into the familiar, dreadful landscape. Across the state, in quiet farmhouses and unassuming suburban homes, others stirred. Old men and women, their faces etched with the passage of time, but their eyes still holding a peculiar, cold fire, a flicker of that graduating night. A woman in a floral apron, her hands trembling, dropped a teacup, the porcelain shattering on the linoleum. A man hunched over a newspaper slowly lowered it, his gaze fixed on nothing, a distant memory blooming behind his eyes. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, a strange sense of inevitability guiding their actions. Keys were found, jackets donned, goodbyes left unsaid. Some drove ancient pickups, their engines coughing to life, while others simply walked, their shuffling steps carrying them towards the distant, beckoning cornfields. They were drawn by an unseen current, a silent, pervasive force that bypassed reason and spoke directly to the scarred heart. The reunion, Thorne's grim harvest, was beginning anew. The reunion. The wind, carrying the ghost of forgotten harvests, whipped around the dilapidated barn, tugging at the frayed edges of Sally Mae's threadbare shawl. Her breath plumed in the chill air, a wispy specter against the deepening twilight. The scent of damp earth and decaying cornstalks, potent and cloying, clung to the landscape, a morbid perfume. 58 years had etched lines onto her face, silvered her once dark hair, but her eyes, the color of faded denim, still held a flicker of the cold fire that had burned there on another graduation night. She pulled her worn wool closer,
not from cold, but from a tremor that started deep in her bones, a premonition of the terror yet to unfold. Around her, others materialized from the encroaching shadows. Jedediah Finch, his shoulders slumped but still broad, his jaw a perpetual knot of defiance, emerged from the skeletal remains of a rusted tractor. The stubble on his chin was white, his movements stiff, yet the set of his mouth spoke of an unyielding purpose. He adjusted the brim of his grimy cap, his gaze sweeping the horizon with an intensity that belied his age, searching for something or someone. When his eyes met Sally's, there was no warmth, only a shared, weary understanding, a grim recognition of their joint damnation. He still carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions, a festering wound of complicity. Clara Bellwether, a wraith in a threadbare coat, drifted from the skeletal remains of what might once have been a fence line. Her once vibrant artistic spirit had been crushed under the weight of decades of institutional walls, her movements now hesitant, almost spectral. Her eyes, once pools of boundless imagination, were now clouded with a perpetual anxiety, darting nervously between the other figures and the darkening sky. She clutched a small, smooth stone in her trembling hand, rubbing it compulsively, as if seeking solace in its cold permanence. A soft whimper escaped her lips, quickly stifled, a sound barely audible above the rising wind. She seemed to shrink further into herself, a fragile bird caught in a storm. More figures emerged, indistinct shapes coalescing into the familiar, aged faces of the class of '58. Their numbers were fewer now, time having claimed its inevitable toll. But those who remained bore the indelible mark of that night. Their gait was slower, their backs bent, their hair streaked with gray or white, but in their eyes a chilling uniformity prevailed. It was a look of quiet anticipation, of a duty long deferred, a conviction that had outlasted sanity itself. The youthful zeal of indoctrination had been replaced by a hardened, almost resigned certainty. They weren't there by choice, not really. They were drawn, compelled by a force that had woven itself into the fabric of their very being. No one spoke. The silence was absolute, broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. The air thrummed with an unspoken tension, a collective breath held in suspended animation. They stood on what had once been the edge of the sprawling cornfields, the same fields that had swallowed their mentor and spat them out as traumatized orphans. The memory of the gymnasium, the screams, the sickening thud of bodies, hung heavy in the air, an invisible shroud. This desolate patch of land, barren and unforgiving, was their altar, their rendezvous point. Sally felt a familiar prickle of dread crawl up her spine. It was the same sensation she'd felt so long ago, a cold certainty that something profound and terrible was about to occur. Jedediah shifted his weight, his eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon for the figure he both loathed and, in some twisted recess of his mind, still sought approval from. Clara's trembling intensified, her gaze fixed on the point where the setting sun bled into the bruised purple of the clouds, as if expecting a sign, a vision to confirm her darkest fears. The sky overhead turned a bruised purple, then deepened to an inky black, punctuated by the first hesitant pinpricks of stars. The air grew colder still, biting at exposed skin. They were all here, the remnants of Hemlock High's graduating class, a morbid congregation. They stood like statues carved from granite and despair, their faces illuminated by the pale, indifferent glow of the emerging moon. They waited, not for an apology, not for absolution, but for their conductor, for Elias Thorne. The next harvest was about to begin.